At Consumer Cellular, you get the same exact coverage as the largest carriers, but for up to half the cost. Same thing, up to half the cost. Up to half the cost for the same thing. 50% the money for 100% the same thing. I hope I'm making myself clear. Consumer Cellular. When freedom calls, we're here to answer. Call us at 1-888-FREEDOM.
Half the cost savings based on cost of Consumer Cellular single-line 5GB data plan with unlimited talk and text compared to lowest cost single-line postpaid unlimited talk, text, and data plan offered by T-Mobile and Verizon May 2023.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and him, Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Although I have to say, Kieran, it's a beautiful, crisp, chilly Sunday morning. I think probably only 50% of us think that football's a beautiful game just at the moment.
I think you're absolutely right. Yes, I've been focused on my birthday cake. The Baroness got me a giant Colin the Caterpillar birthday cake, which apparently is enough for 35 people. But the trouble is, nobody apart from me wanted to eat it. So I'm working my way through it, and the fear is it's taking me so long, it'll turn into a butterfly before I actually finish the damn thing.
Other cakes are available. It's questions day, Kieran, but we do have one big news story to discuss first, and one big apology to our next door neighbours, who are probably still wondering why we both shouted bollocks so loudly on Wednesday afternoon. Literally minutes after we finished recording, Roman Abramovich announced his intention to sell Chelsea and write off the £1.5 billion that they owe him. We've had a lot of people, Kieran, asking how that might affect FFP, him writing off that loan or those loans.
Yes. Well, in terms of the loan, because the loan's a balance sheet item, it doesn't impact upon either income or cost. So it has zero impact on financial fair play. So Chelsea, who have racked up some significant losses in recent years, they won't be able to use this to reset the dial as far as the FFP issues are concerned. But I think what he said and what he didn't say in the press release was just as important. Whilst we've got his daughter going on social media saying this is Putin's war, and she appears to be fairly on the side of anti-Putin. It was a very ambivalent comment that came from Roman Abramovich's press release. It said that the net proceeds of the sale would go to helping the victims of the war. And let's not call it a conflict; it is a war.
Yeah.
And I think that raises a few questions. First of all, what exactly is meant by net proceeds? Presumably issues in terms of stamp duty, lawyers' fees, accountants' fees, are they being deducted? He says that the loan he's going to absorb. If that is the case, then the asking price, and I've heard this from a few senior sources, is £3 billion.
Wow!
I think that's a bit pushy myself, because the issue with Chelsea is Stamford Bridge. They are hemmed in by other neighbours who are very rich and very litigious. So the chances of getting the opportunity to expand Stamford Bridge are pretty slim, in my view, and also would take years to get through the courts, because the neighbours would use every vehicle in their book to delay things. So therefore, if Chelsea want to compete with Manchester United, who've got a capacity of 74,000, with Liverpool, who are moving to 60,000, you've got Arsenal, Spurs and West Ham all at 60,000, Manchester City mid-50s, potentially going to 60. Newcastle's new owners are talking about expanding. They're going to have to move. And you live in London. I was born in London. There's not many pieces of ground. There's not many pieces of free land where people think, oh yeah, that looked nice for a 60,000 capacity football stadium. And of course, land in London's very expensive. So it's going to cost you $1.5 billion probably to build a new stadium to the size required. And then Chelsea fans might feel that it's it's far away from what they're used to, is it genuinely Chelsea? So I think there are issues. Why pay £3 billion for a company that doesn't make money and a company which is going to have to relocate its biggest asset?
And it's interesting, Kieran, because you valued Palace recently, or you said Palace's value was somewhere between sort of 220, 240 million. And we're a mid-ranking Premier League club. So £3 billion for a team, as you say, are sort of stuck at Stamford Bridge for the near future without that much opportunity to make more money. That's a hefty price, Kieran, isn't it? Even by Russian oligarch standards.
That's right. And then you've got to ask yourself who would want to buy it. So are there other ultra high net worth individuals who fancy a slice of the Premier League pie? Yes, there are, and we've already seen a few names being mentioned. There's the 86-year-old Swiss billionaire. There's some people in the States who are billionaires as well who own US franchises. So could they be interested? Yes, possibly. Could we have another sovereign wealth fund arrive in the Premier League? We've got UAE at City. We've got the issues now with PIF at Newcastle, Qatar in Paris. Could it be from the Middle East, or perhaps the likes of Brunei, where the Sultan there might decide that he wants the kudos of owning Chelsea. And Chelsea are a very attractive proposition in the sense regularly compete in the Champions League, present Champions League holders, FIFA World Cup club, but £3 billion certainly on all of the spreadsheet models that I've worked on in the past few days, that doesn't make any sense. So you'd have to pay a huge vanity premium for it, Jim Ratcliffe, who's Britain's richest man, says there will be a mug who will pay £2 or £3 billion for a football club, possibly, but that mug's not me. And he went off and he bought a club in France for about a 20th of that. So, I think it's an ambitious price, shall we say?
It's interesting as well, Kieran, because historically, one of the only reasons Chelsea exists at Stamford Bridge is because back at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, a very charismatic entrepreneur built Stamford Bridge, assuming that one of the existing London clubs would happily rent it off him and move in, and no one was interested. So he had to form his own team, essentially. And one final thing here, and I think we have to say this, those Chelsea fans who sang Abramovich's name during the minutes of applause for Ukraine yesterday had 90 minutes in which they could have done that. Yeah. Choosing to do it in that time was wrong. And I'm pleased that Thomas Tuchel accepted that as well. I thought it was very good that Thomas Tuchel criticised those few Chelsea fans that did it. All right, on to the questions, Kieran, and there's a few more light-hearted questions in there than there are news stories. Let's put it this way. So, one in particular I don't understand, but I'm sure you will help. I'm sure you'll help me. I actually think that most weeks, Kieran. I very rarely say it out loud, but there you are. Zach Dalton asks our first question, and Zach says, "What are the rules regarding a player being released from his contract when he retires? For example, could a player agree a new contract with an increased wage if the club wants to secure him for a few more seasons, when all along the player planned to retire after one season but decided to ask for a new deal or accept a new deal for a final payday? If a player wants to retire, is there anything the club can do to keep them contracted and playing?" I suppose, Kieran, the answer is that clubs won't offer a 31-year-old player a 3-year contract unless they're managed by Harry Redknapp or Sam Allardyce.
I don't know what you could possibly mean there, Kevin. Don't know what you could possibly mean.
I'm just saying, historically, they tend to buy experienced players in the bid to keep the club up.
Indeed. Well, I asked our good friend of the show, Jonathan Booker, with relation to this, because clearly he's a man that's looked after the interests of his clients, having been an agent. And I think Jonathan's view, which is broadly the same as sort of my first reaction, was if a player wants to retire, then that's a personal choice. But the chances are that the club will retain the player's registration for the remaining period of the contract.
Right.
So this is to stop let's say that we do sign a 3 or 4 year contract at the age of 31, and then announce 12 months later, that's it, I've had enough. And everybody gets your final cheer, and then 3 months later you rock up at another club and you say, I've come out of retirement.
Yeah.
So the registration would be maintained by the original club. Now, it would possibly allow the player to compete in amateur football, provided there's no evidence of him being paid. He could go and play for a local park side. Chances are you would get away with that. But if he did choose to come back, then compensation would have to be paid to the original club, to his former club, by the professional club that he ended up playing for. Right. So that's to protect the club. And often what we do see is that if a player does announce retirement, and we've seen people like Gary Neville just said, I just realised I could. He got absolutely roasted, didn't he, at Stoke, and then decided to hang up his boots because he felt he couldn't maintain the standard to which he himself expected to be able to deliver. If that is the case, quite often what the club will say is, we want you to carry on in a different role, an ambassadorial role, perhaps move into coaching, and that helps to protect the player as well. The player might, and people talk a lot about football players being in it just for the money. Football players start off because they love football. You didn't start a comedy career because you hated jokes, did you?
No.
It's counterintuitive. Why did I go into teaching? Because I love the thought of teaching, and you might hate it after a few years and decide to go on elsewhere. But nobody starts in football because of a hatred of football and wanting to hang up their boots. So I think the club would be protected, and the player potentially will be able to earn a different salary in a different role, and that could be embedded into a contract, especially if it's a more senior player.
Yeah, I don't tell jokes, Kieran. I tell finely crafted routines. I think. Right. Also, the thing is with footballers as well, who are most unfairly criticised bunch of people, most of them have to be dragged kicking and screaming into retirement because they still love playing football at the age of 35 as much as they did at the age of 18, 19. It's an awful thing when people don't realise they've still got half their working life ahead of them. And they can't do the thing that they love doing the most, as well, of course, as missing the whole dressing room environment, which is another big issue. Our next question comes from Chris Dobson, and I'll give a bit of context to overseas listeners at the end of the question. But Chris Dobson says, I'm a ground hopper, and as a Yorkshireman, I love a good deal. Tell me about it. I remember my cousin Charles from Bradford in the Pawson's Arms a couple of years ago saying to Bev, how bloody much? I want to buy a pint, not the pub. Which she thought was hilarious. Now, Chris says, going to a Premier League or EFL game is expensive, so it's nice to see that some teams host under-23 games in their main stadium now. For example, a league game at Wigan would cost £23, but 2 days later, an under-23 game was £3, so you can see the appeal. My question is, apart from a good experience for the young players, plus a cheap day out for families, what's the financial impact for the clubs hosting those matches at their league grounds? Now, I should explain to some of our overseas listeners, as I said, what ground hopping is. It is, I think, a uniquely British phenomenon where you see a game at all 92 league grounds, then work your way down the pyramid like some football archaeologist until you find yourself swimming to the Scilly Isles for a pre-season friendly. They are very competitive people. Approach them with caution.
Yes.
And only if you have a few hours listening time to spare. It's a fair point, though, from Chris. Palace played a couple of under-20 cup games earlier this season, end of last season, I beg your pardon, and got 67,000 people in. So does it make financial sense for them to play games there rather than the academy where there'd be 30 people watching?
I don't think there's a huge amount of financial benefit. It is mainly to, first of all, to allow the players to get a sense of what it is like to play at Selhurst or to play at the Wigan Stadium. And we've seen in women's football, many of the women's teams don't play at the host stadium, but once or twice a season they will do. And I think it's as we were talking, footballers love football, and it still is a dream to actually kick a football in a football stadium. My last ever game of football, I played at the Amex Stadium.
Wow.
I came on for 10 minutes. I was absolutely dreadful, but it cost me £1,500 for the privilege. I'd raised money for charity, and I thought I've not put enough money in it. But I can say that I've played at a football ground.
Yeah.
You can see it from the player's point of view. You're absolutely right. You are going to get a bigger attendance. Is it likely to make money? The chances are not, because the costs of hosting at a ground tend to be quite significant. You've got the setup costs, you've got the turnstiles, you're going to have to clean the changing rooms. So you got the physical financial costs, and then you've got what we might refer to as the opportunity costs. As I'm sure you've interviewed these guys, and I've met one or two. Groundsmen are extremely protective about the hallowed turf.
Oh yes.
And therefore, if they had their way, there would be no matches taking place, including the first team, over the full 365 days, and they can just concentrate on mowing the grass. But they know that they accept that the first team have to play there. They don't want any more to take place than that. We've seen the improvement in the quality of football pitches, because you and I are both old enough to remember those matches in the 70s where football took place on rolled mud.
Yeah.
And that's what we accepted because we knew no different. But what we've now got is far slicker, far truer surfaces. And the groundsman would say, well, the reason for this is I'm allowed to effectively have 7 to 10 days between most matches to prepare, and therefore they don't want too many alternative uses of the pitch. And I think that would be a driving force. And also, from the club's point of view, they're fully aware that if the pitch is less than perfect, then the performance is less than perfect as well.
Speaking of women's football, Kieran, I don't often plug other people's pods, but a friend of mine sent me a link to a thing called Durham Rawcast last night, which is a new podcast about Durham women's football team. And as it happened, I'll be honest, the telly was on the blink last night, so I thought, well, I will listen to it. And it was very good. It's very interesting. But Durham women are one of the few teams not affiliated to a men's team. Yep. So it strikes me that might be an interesting subject for us to talk about at some stage as well. It's a very good pod, by the way. Our next question comes from Dave Tucker. And there seems to be a couple of Arsenal fans unhappy sneaking in questions under the radar, disguised as normal questions, but are actually criticisms of Arsenal. And Dave says, what would attendances have to drop to at Arsenal for them to stop making a profit on match days? Dave's about to clutch at an enormous straw here, by the way. Dave says, I appreciate the TV revenue is huge, but they would surely notice it if match day income dropped. I say this because if the Kroenkes' finances suffer, they may just want out. And hopefully they won't be around for long. Be careful what you wish for, Dave. But I imagine, Kieran, they could be playing in front of nobody and still making money, couldn't they?
Not quite. Arsenal generate more money from ticket sales, or sorry, a greater proportion of money from ticket sales than any other club in the Premier League. So in 2019, which is the last year that we have pre-COVID and from which we can therefore extract what I would call reliable data, Arsenal generated 24% of their income from ticket sales. Now that contrasts with the likes of Burnley, Huddersfield, Bournemouth at the time, who were getting 4%. So it is significant. But Arsenal, even though they had full capacity at all matches, were still losing money on a day-to-day basis. Even though the Emirates was 60,000 sellouts each week. So unfortunately, any reduction in ticket sales, Dave, would have an impact upon the Arsenal's finances. And the reason for this is Arsenal have stopped competing in the Champions League for quite a few years. So that's probably hit them somewhere in the region of 40 to 50 million pounds a year. And what we have seen during that period is that Arsenal's wage bill has dropped significantly behind that of its peer group. And that has an impact upon performance because I've got no issue, as I've said on many occasions, with regards to players' wages, but ultimately football is a talent game, and the best talent gets paid the highest wages by those willing to pay those highest wages. Arsenal are no longer at the top tier of playing wages, and I think that might be a consideration for Arsenal fans, is that are you actually, cutting off your nose to spite your face? If you stop attending matches, that means there's less money to pay the wages, which means that the club becomes less competitive, which means it can't get into the top 4 positions, which generate the additional money to make Arsenal on a level playing field with the clubs that they consider to be their peer group.
Our next question comes from Jack Thompson. And Jack Thompson says, if a player gets in trouble after moving clubs for a significant transfer fee, are the clubs insured or can they go after the player personally? I would guess, Kieran, that the selling club would have no responsibility, would they, unless they were aware that there was trouble coming up?
Yeah, it's sold as seen. It's a bit like if my Uncle Terry sold you a car. You just have to accept what you get. But in terms of historic positions, we take ourselves back to a good friend of the show, Adrian Mutu, who pops up on quite a regular basis.
He does.
Chelsea signed Adrian Mutu, who was I think it's a Romanian international. Yep. They paid around about 15-16 million pounds for him. He was seen as a pretty useful striker. Adrian had a few off-field issues, which involved South American products, shall we say. And on the basis of that, Chelsea ended up sacking him. He was suspended from football. And then they tried to sue him on a personal basis for the money that they'd spent, and also the money that they'd effectively had to spend to replace him. And I think they replaced him with Sean Wright-Phillips, and they used the fee paid for Sean Wright-Phillips as the basis for establishing the amount of compensation that they were due to get from Adrian Mutu. And when it went to court, Chelsea won the case. Now, whether they ever got the money, I'm not sure. That was all. That's all a private settlement. But I think they would have felt vindicated that they'd signed Adrian Mutu in good faith, and his behavioural issues warranted some form of financial compensation.
Our next question comes from Larkin Hogle, who I believe is one of our regular Australian listeners. A country in mourning, of course, after the loss of one of the greatest cricketers ever. Larkin says, in light of your discussion about the number of clubs in Scottish football, do you have any thoughts on the ideal number of clubs per population? Here are some quick calculations. Open brackets, done in a pub on a napkin, so please excuse poor rounding. Close brackets. Yes, that's pretty much how I write the script, Larkin. So I forgive you. Kieran may be a little bit more hardline about the rounding, but there you go. And Larkin says, so in Germany, it works out pretty much that there's one professional football club per 1.5 million people. In Spain, it's one per 1.6 million people. In Italy, there's one club per 1 million people. In England and Wales, it's one per 650,000. In Scotland, it's one per 130,000. Ideally, says Larkin, as many clubs as possible should, of course, be allowed to play. But what if it's simply not sustainable in the long term? I mean, I suppose you could argue in England and Scotland, it's been sustainable pretty much since 1880. So, COVID allowing, there's no reason why it shouldn't sort of carry on being sustainable, should it?
Yeah, well, first of all, top work, Larkin, top napkin work. I say I'm very impressed by this. I think if you're going to do an analysis, one of the things you need to take into consideration, I know what Larkin has done. He looked at the number of teams in the senior leagues, but in Scotland, once you drop out of the Premiership and into the Championship, you then start to enter the realms of some of the clubs are already part-time.
Yeah.
And then when you drop into the bottom 2 divisions of Scotland, they're practically all part-time. So that helps sustainability. And also, because we are now into March, we're entering peak financial reporting season. So I've been in spreadsheet heaven practically every day this week. I'm getting these emails from Company's House, and anybody who's the misfortune to follow my Twitter account will know that it doesn't matter whether it's Albion Rovers or Arsenal. I'm out there putting out numbers, and what we are seeing in Scottish football is almost all of those lower league Scottish clubs are reporting that they're breaking even or making a small profit. Now, part of this is due to the utilisation of the furlough scheme. Part of this is also down to the incredible benevolence of James Anderson, who is a Scottish football fan who decided to help Scottish football, and he's effectively given grants to practically everybody there, and those smaller clubs have benefited. So my observation of Scottish lower league football in recent years is the clubs are actually very, very sensible. They know that they can't compete with the big boys, and therefore they don't try to compete with the big boys, and they just get on with it. And they set budgets accordingly. And thing is, being sustainable means not living beyond your means, knowing how much money you've got coming in, and then setting your level of expenditure accordingly. What we have in English football, especially in the Championship, is we want to get to the Premier League. This is how much we think it's going to cost us. And you ignore the fact that that amount of money is twice as much as the money you're bringing in. So I think the mindset of Scottish football is far more logical, it's far more sensible, and it's far more sustainable. So in terms of his question, I sort of flip it over. I think all of these countries can survive and thrive with the existing number of clubs that they have, provided they just act with a bit of common sense.
I've spoken to a lot of Scottish football fans over the years because I've spent a lot of time in Scotland, and it's strange the ones that antsy is not the right word, because Scottish football fans in general are a philosophical and funny bunch of people, but Hibs fans can be a bit antsy because they're a big club, but they know they still can't compete with the biggest clubs. But when you talk to fans of clubs lower down, Queen of the South, for example, I spoke to a Queen of the South fan recently. There's an attitude that they know they'd probably never get into the Scottish Premier League. They might get in the Championship if they're lucky. So they're actually quite happy just being in existence, just competing. They have a bit of credibility. The fans of those clubs think that they're proper fans in the way that some of the big Scottish club fans aren't. They're just quite happy bimbling along's not right, but just knowing that they've got a club to support and trying to do as well as possible in the league they're in. And that's an attitude that keeps you much saner at night than constantly looking at the Premier League table thinking we could finish ninth here. It seems to me that football's a happier place for some of those Scottish fans.
Yeah. I'm not married to a supermodel, but I don't go to sleep being jealous about it every night. I've got the Baroness, and I'm still punching well above my weight there. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Be happy with what you got. Yeah, we are very, very fortunate.
The Baroness, Kieran, I know she doesn't listen, but she's not far short of supermodel, Kieran, really, let's face it. As is Ali, of course. Who doesn't listen to the pod, but is only 3 yards away, possibly paying attention. Our next question comes from Andy Barker. And Andy Barker says, Leeds surprisingly sold Niall Hewins, apologies if I've got that pronunciation wrong, to Sunderland on a free transfer. They did insert a sell-on clause, and Andy says that Niall is an excellent prospect. So if he progresses and a big club comes in for him, could Sunderland adopt a pragmatic approach and accept a lower fee but a higher sell-on clause in order to potentially get more money if he goes to a bigger club still? And is there anything Leeds could do to prevent this?
Yes, and I imagine Leeds will have done this, and I suspect this is fairly standard. What will happen is Leeds will say that as far as the sell-on clause is concerned, they are entitled to, let's say it's 20%. They are entitled to 20% of everything that Sunderland receive in respect of the sale of Niall Hewins. So that could be 20% of the initial fee plus 20% of any add-ons should that player be sold again, and therefore Sunderland get a share of that. So I think I would imagine that's fairly standard. I don't see the small print of contracts, but I think it would be fairly remiss of any club to selling to not try to future proof any particular deals. I think the one concern that some clubs do have is what happens if he moves on as part of a swap deal. Now, then I don't know how those calculations would be made, if at all. But that is something to be that would be of interest. We're hoping to have an agent come on the show in a few weeks, and he's agreed to do an Ask the Agent session.
Nice.
So once we've got a date sorted, we'll let listeners know, and that means that me and you can just sit there with a cup of tea and listen to him. have to put up with all the heat.
It's an interesting point from Andy though about Sunderland's approach. Because it's sort of a risky one, but you can sort of see his point of view that they take a gamble that he will become an even better player, so they will move him on with a higher sell-on clause to see if that happens, as against taking a higher fee now.
It's a calculated gamble, and also going back to what we were talking about earlier. These young kids want to play football, and if we're realistic and he's not going to be breaking into the first team squad and he's going to be frustrated because he's in the under-23s playing in PL2 and so on, then it's better for him potentially on both a short and a long-term basis that he gets the opportunity to play in League One, which the standard's still damn good, and to be up against professionals every week who are fighting for every ball because their bonuses are linked to it, and Sunderland are trying to get promoted.
Luke Hatherley has our next question, and Luke Hatherley says Nottingham Forest have had a stupid amount of managers in a short space of time recently, although they seem to have settled on a good one at the moment. What's been the cost of these managers to the club?
Right. I've been into Forest's accounts over the course of the last decade, and they do not show separately the amount of money that's spent. And should they have to do this from a nosiness point of view? I would say yes.
How about from a legal point of view, Kieran?
But from a legal point of view, it's questionable. Under the accounting rules, you are supposed to show what's referred to as exceptional costs, and exceptional is normally sort of is it going to change the dials in terms of the numbers? So Forest might say that the numbers aren't actually that big, but what I did find out is, and what did surprise me, was that over the course of the last decade, so we often talk about football clubs, especially in the Championship, and Forest have been a pretty much a hardy perennial of the Championship for a number of years. Over the course of the last decade, Nottingham Forest have generated £196 million in revenue, and they have spent £293 million on wages alone. So included in that £293 million will be the payoffs to managers. But this goes back to what we've just been talking about in respect of Scottish football. It's not sustainable in the English Championship, and somebody is signing off on those budgets at the start of every season and saying, this year, we'll aim to go and spend no more than £160 on wages for every £100 get in. And they all sit around and they nod, and nobody is playing the role of Jiminy Cricket and going, this is daft, boys. You're not making any sense. And if we can get a collective decision to try to live within the means, as we've seen, and we've spoken to people like Andy Holt and Mark Palios and some of the other club owners and executives, and they say, well, we're simply not prepared to do it. We'll accept a little bit of a loss, but the levels of losses that clubs are incurring in the Championship are just crazy.
I know that Pinocchio, of course, is based on an Italian book, but Jiminy Cricket has to be one of the most annoying characters in any Disney film ever, doesn't he? And I love Disney films. Early Disney films, one of my big passions. But Jiminy Cricket, just shut up. Just let the boy have some fun while he's not made of wood. Jesus. So can I just clarify there, Kieran? So the money that Forest have paid on getting rid of managers, compensation, etc., that's gone down under the wages.
It tends to be included in the wage bill because it's quite a lot of the time what will happen, and I don't know whether this is the case for Forest, is that they simply pay the manager on a monthly basis rather than necessarily giving them a full settlement immediately, which could be bad for cash flow. They just say, well, you've still got 18 months left on your contract. We'll pay you what's due to you each month and just get on with it. So it tends to be quite often included within the payroll costs.
We know, Kieran, that producer Guy is a big fan of putting these questions together using the William Burroughs cut-up technique, which is how David Bowie wrote some of his early songs, by basically cutting out loads of words from a newspaper, throwing them up in the air and seeing what order they come out in. But as it happens, Luke's question leads quite nicely into the next question. It's not
Here comes a BAFTA.
This could be the moment, Kieran, couldn't it? Because the wild segues must be one of the reasons that BAFTA is paying no notice. Andy Cook's question is, when a manager is sacked, they receive some sort of financial payout of their contract. Is it literally the pay that would be due for the remainder of the contract? And is that payout negotiated up front as a termination clause, or are the clubs allowed to unilaterally terminate the contract as long as they pay the remainder of the money?
It does vary according to circumstance. So if we take the case of David Moyes and Manchester United, David Moyes, I think he signed a 6-year contract because he was very much Sir Alex's chosen man.
Yeah.
And he was sacked about 8 months into the season. And what it is supposedly to be the case, and I've not seen the contract, but I'm only going on what I've heard from some people within the game, is that there was a clause in the contract which says, should Manchester United fail to qualify for the Champions League, then Manchester United do not have to pay up the full remainder of the contract. This would be, I think it was in the first year or the second year. They don't have to pay up the full amount. They only have to give him 12 months compensation. Now, Manchester United, I think they drew or lost a match on the Sunday, and then they sacked him 24 hours later. So the club was effectively waiting for the period of time when it could save them money by sacking him, even though that there was a lot of pressure on the board to have sacked him earlier. So sometimes what's driving these decisions is these particular clauses. In general, what clubs tend to do is that they do pay up for the remainder of the contract because the League Managers Association has advisors. The point about signing a 3 or 4 year contract is to provide security on both sides. First of all, the club gets security that if your manager is headhunted, you say, well, we need compensation because there's still 3 years remaining on his contract. And also the manager who might have been attracted from elsewhere, he should have some form of protection through having a fixed term contract. So what tends to happen is there will be a clause which says you will get all of your basic wage up until the remainder of your contract, or there will be a set sum agreed in the contract that goes to the manager, linked to the remaining years and months that are outstanding.
Our final question, Kieran, comes from Sam Watson. And Sam has an interesting take on a subject we've discussed a lot lately. Sam says, when West Ham played Dinamo Zagreb in the Europa League, our usual sponsor, Betway, was not on the front of our shirt. In all the other games so far, their name has been. Are gambling sponsors banned in certain countries? Was that the reason? And if so, how does that affect the contract with the sponsor? I assume there are bonuses for a team getting into Europe when negotiating for shirt sponsors, and therefore West Ham might be losing out, or will Betway have fronted up more money for less gain?
There are some industries which, under the UEFA rules, cannot be advertised on the front of shirt, and these are mainly, first of all, tobacco, and secondly, strong alcohol. Okay, whatever that is.
So Carling would be all right then. That would be fine. Yeah. Right.
So, but if you think about it, I think UEFA do have beer sponsors. Is it Heineken?
Heineken, yeah.
Yep. So
huge sponsor.
And I remember going to the Euros in France, and I think they only served either alcohol free or 0.5%, which my advisors tell me is the equivalent of alcohol free beer within the stadiums themselves. Now, when it comes to Betway, I think originally West Ham were using Betway on some of the matches, and I've certainly seen photographs of Wolverhampton Wanderers who've been sponsored by ManBetX, or one of these sort of generic white label, not quite sure where they're from, gambling organisations.
Well, they used to sponsor Palace. They're gambling, and they're basically a porn website with gambling attached. So there's two reasons why a lot of Palace fans weren't that happy about them being our sponsor. But no, as to where they're from, that's a moot question.
Right, okie dokes. But what I understand is that UEFA now have a partnership, and I don't know how recently this was signed, with bwin as their official gambling sponsor. And therefore, I think under certain rules that operate within UEFA, and I know that this is the case with FIFA as well, is that you're not allowed to advertise a rival product, because if UEFA have an official car sponsor, let's say it's going to be Audi, then you couldn't potentially have Ford as a front of shirt sponsor. So I think that it's actually more linked to that than in the case of not having a European contract, because certainly I've seen pictures of West Ham in Europe where I'm pretty certain they've had the Betway logos on the front of their shirts. But I did see these particular shirts, and we've had this discussion before. I'd much rather buy a shirt which doesn't have a logo on it, and that's not because I'm pro or anti the individual sponsor. I just like football shirts as football shirts.
Oh God, don't get me started on that. They're much nicer without the sponsor's name on. Speaking of UEFA and speaking of Russia, as you were at the start, have UEFA made an announcement about their relationship with Gazprom?
Yes, so UEFA have terminated the sponsorship arrangement with Gazprom, and it will not be featured on Champions League and Europa League matches for the foreseeable future.
Oh, okay. Well done, UEFA. Producer Guy, I think sometimes takes our audience intelligence for granted a little bit, because there's only so many times, Kieran, I can read out that there are still literally 1 or 2 tickets available for our sold-out show at AFC Wimbledon. There were literally only 1 or 2 extra tickets available last pod, Kieran, and I believe before that there was just a few available. But there are, I will read it again because there are 2 extra tickets available. We sold out the first 200, 24th of March, AFC Wimbledon, for our first ever live pod spectacular. And we're having a meeting on Tuesday, I believe, Kieran, via Zoom to discuss the spectacular bits of it.
Yes.
I think we might be getting a flashing light collar for Finley. Is that right? Just
that's a good thought. That
turn the lights off. Finley runs around in the dark. Or we could train Finley if we do the Q&A in the second part. He could pad around with the microphone between his teeth. But there are a couple of tickets left, and you go to where you're listening to this pod, and there should be a link to how you buy them. If you'd like to make a contribution to our always free to air pod, then that's very kind of you, and you can do so by going to patreon.com/priceoffootball. And if you have any questions for future editions of the pod, it's questions@priceoffootball.com. And in the meantime, I shall hand you over to Mr. Kieran Maguire for his customary farewell.
Well, once again, thanks for all your support for the show. We're genuinely extremely excited at the prospect of meeting some of you at Plough Lane in less than 3 weeks, and we've not written anything yet. So is that called improv?
No, it's not improv. We've got it's all. I've written some stuff down actually, so don't worry.
Oh, okay.
There's a show. Don't be putting people off buying those literally 1 or 2 tickets.
But if you want to support the show, Patreon is one. and just general engagement is great. But one of the things which does make a difference, according to Producer Guy, is that if you could give us a review using your app, Spotify now do them, clearly Apple do them as well. Be honest, but if you can give us 5 stars, by all accounts, apparently it helps us in the charts. And I do have a spreadsheet as to where we've been in the charts for every single week since I started the show, and we're doing okay. But it doesn't matter what you say in the comments. So you could say, and I would love this to be the case. You would say you would rather have the show presented by Rod Marsh and Shane Warne, 2 of my all-time heroes. I remember I was 13 years old and I asked Rod Marsh for his autograph, and he gave me a little ruffle of the hair. Yeah, no worries, Sonny. And he was just a wonderful cricketer. Clearly, Shane Warne. I think you've met Shane, haven't you, Kevin? And
I had a weekend. Yeah, I had a weekend with Shane Warne one night in the British studio. He was I'm quite touched that between us we've met Rod Marsh and Shane Warne. Shane Warne was one of the nicest people I've ever met, and just I don't remember much about it for obvious reasons. But any night out, that if I was Shane Warne and Phil Tufnell, is always going to end up fuzzy. But Shane Warne was delightful, and I was genuinely shocked to hear of his passing. But I tell you what, I would listen to it. I don't normally listen to this podcast, Kieran, but if it was hosted by Rod Marsh and Shane Warne, I would definitely listen.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, folks, so thanks again. Bye-bye.
The price of football. The price of football.